Hello and welcome back to Schnee Reads Call of the Wild number 6. This is Chapter 2, Part 2. So, as always, we are looking at how the particular lines of dialogue or events propel the action and reveal the aspects of character, Buck's character especially. And we are looking at that idea of a central theme, and that central theme of what does it take to make Buck become more wild as he goes. In your work tonight, you're going to be using particular words and phrases and determining how they are used to explain Buck's situation, and you will answer some questions using details from the text. So what happened last time in the first part of chapter 2? So Buck learned that being nice doesn't get you anywhere in the dog sled world. He watched Curly be brutally attacked by a group of vicious dogs and watched Spitz laugh at the entire thing. So now he also knows that he cannot really trust Spitz all that much. However, after this, he falls into a routine of learning how to run in a dog sled. Francois, Dave, and even Spitz were good teachers. Some more new dogs have been added to the group, Billy and Joe. And by the end of this section, Buck is trying to figure out how and where to sleep. He figured out, with the help of Billy, that the dogs burrow into the snow at night. So we're going to watch this video very quickly of how dogs became the domestic pets that we know them to be. They were not always man's best friend. Buck was not always, or Buck's type of dog would not always have been a family pet. So this video is about 4 or 5 minutes long, and we're going to watch this because it kind of goes to show that even though animals become domestic, they never fully lose that instinctual wild part of themselves, and these are the things that are definitely going to be pulling Buck in the direction to leave domesticity, or leave being a domestic dog and go into being a more wild dog.
Since their emergence over 200,000 years ago, modern humans have established homes and communities all over the planet, but they didn't do it alone. Whatever corner of the globe you find Homo sapiens in today, you're likely to find another species nearby, Canis lupus familiaris. Whether they're herding, hunting, sledding, or slouching, the sheer variety of domestic dogs is staggering. But what makes the story of man's best friend so surprising is that they all evolved from a creature often seen as one of our oldest rivals, Canis lupus, or the gray wolf. When our Paleolithic ancestors first settled Eurasia roughly 100,000 years ago, wolves were one of their main rivals at the top of the food chain. Able to exert over 300 pounds of pressure in one bone-crushing bite and sniff out prey more than a mile away, these formidable predators didn't have much competition. Much like human hunter-gatherers, they lived and hunted in complex social groups consisting of a few nuclear families, and used their social skills to cooperatively take down larger creatures. Using these group tactics, they operated as effective persistence hunters, relying not on outrunning their prey, but pursuing it to the point of exhaustion. But when pitted against the similar strengths of their invasive new neighbors, wolves found themselves at a crossroads. For most packs, these burgeoning bipeds represented a serious threat to their territory. But for some wolves, especially those without a pack, human camps offered new opportunities. Wolves that showed less aggression towards humans could come closer to their encampments, feeding on leftovers. And as these more docile scavengers outlasted their aggressive brethren, their genetic traits were passed on, gradually breeding tamer wolves in areas near human populations. Over time, humans found a multitude of uses for these docile wolves. They helped to track and hunt prey, and might have served as sentinels to guard camps and warn of approaching enemies. Their similar social structure made it easy to integrate with human families and learn to understand their commands. Eventually, they moved from the fringes of our communities into our homes, becoming humanity's first domesticated animal. The earliest of these proto-dogs, or wolf dogs, seem to have appeared around 33,000 years ago, and would not have looked all that different from their wild cousins. They were primarily distinguished by their smaller size and a shorter snout full of comparatively smaller teeth. But as human cultures and occupations became more diverse and specialized, so did our friends. Short, stocky dogs to herd livestock by nipping their heels. Elongated dogs to flush badgers and foxes out of burrows. Thin and sleek dogs for racing. And large, muscular dogs for guard duty. With the emergence of kennel clubs and dog shows during England's Victorian era, these dog types were standardized into breeds, with many new ones bred purely for appearance. Sadly, while all dog breeds are the product of artificial selection, some are healthier than others. Many of these aesthetic characteristics come with congenital health problems, such as difficulty breathing or being prone to spinal injuries. Humanity's longest experiment in controlled evolution has had other side effects as well. Generations of selection for tameness have favored more juvenile and submissive traits that were pleasing to humans. This phenomenon of selecting traits associated with youth is known as neoteny and can be seen in many domestic animals. Thousands of years of coevolution may even have bonded us chemically. Not only can canines understand our emotions and body language, but when dogs and humans interact, both our bodies release oxytocin, a hormone commonly associated with feelings of love and protectiveness. It might be difficult to fathom how every Pomeranian, Chihuahua, and Poodle are descended from fierce wolves. But the diversity of breeds today is the result of a relationship that precedes cities, agriculture, and even the disappearance of our Neanderthal cousins. And it's heartening to know that given enough time, even our most dangerous rivals can become our fiercest friends. Have you ever wondered how dogs see with their noses, or if they experience pain the same way we do? Learn more about our brilliant best buddies with these animations.
So now that you have watched that video about how dogs became domesticated, it's not too hard to understand how they could still be tied and linked to those old ways, and if a domestic dog were to go into the wild, how they might be able to go back to the old way of living. So now that you've watched this short video, continue on to read Chapter 2, Part 2, and then you're going to answer your questions as usual in your Schoology quiz. All right, so now we're going to read Chapter 2, Part 2, The Law of Club and Fang. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, eh? Buck confidently selected a spot, and with much fuss and waste effort, proceeded to dig a hole for himself. In a trice the heat from his body filled the confined space, and he was asleep. The day had been long and arduous, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Nor did he open his eyes till roused by the noise of the waking camp. At first he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow walls pressed him in on every side, and a great surge of fear swept through him, the fear of the wild thing for the trap. It was a token that he was harking back through in his own life to the lives of his forebears, for he was a civilized dog, an unduly civilized dog, and of his own experience knew no trap, and so could not of himself fear it. The muscles of his whole body contracted spasmodically, and instinctively the hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end, and with a ferocious snarl he bounded straight up into the blinding day, the snow flying about him in a flashing cloud. Ere he landed on his feet, he saw the white camp spread out before him, and knew where he was, and remembered all that had passed from the time he went for a stroll with Manuel to the hole he had dug for himself the night before. So, being a spoiled farm dog and not really knowing snow, he fears being buried in it and is disoriented because he had a long, hard day. He was tired. He had been, fretted by dreams all night long. So when he wakes up, he doesn't quite know where he is. He doesn't remember what's happened. He doesn't really know snow, so he's afraid of it. However, he soon finds that there's nothing to be afraid of. A shout from Francois hailed his appearance. "What I say?" the dog driver called to Perrault. "That buck for sure learn quick as anything." Perrault nodded gravely. As courier for the Canadian government bearing important dispatches, he was anxious to secure the best dogs, and he was particularly gladdened by the possession of Buck. 3 more huskies were added to the team inside an hour, making a total of 9. And before another quarter of an hour had passed, they were in harness and swinging up the trail toward the Dia Canyon. Buck was glad to be done, and though the work was hard, he found he did not particularly despise it. He was surprised at the eagerness which animated the whole team and which was communicated him. But still more surprising was the change wrought in Dave and Sol-leks. They were new dogs, utterly transformed by the harness. All passiveness and unconcern had dropped from them. They were alert and active, anxious that the work should go well, and fiercely irritable with whatever, by delay or confusion, retarded that work. The toil of the traces seemed the supreme expression of their being and all they lived for, and the only thing in which they took delight. So these dogs love running in the harness and pulling the sled team. And because of that, they come alive. So these are 2 dogs who are very standoffish. They want to be left alone. They don't want to deal with other dogs. They are very on their own and aside from everybody else. But at this point, when they get the chance to run in the harness, it is their sole purpose and passion in life. So they spring to life and become completely different animals at this point. Dave was wheeler, or sled dog. Pulling in from front of him was Buck, and then came Sol-leks. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had been purposely placed between Dave and Sol-leks so that he might receive instruction. Apt scholar that he was, they were equally apt teachers, never allowing him to linger long in error, and enforcing their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and very wise. He never nipped Buck without cause, and he never failed to nip him when he stood in need of it. As Francois's whip backed him up, Buck found it to be cheaper to mend his ways than to retaliate. Once during a brief halt, when he got tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Sol-leks flew at him and administered a sound trouncing. The resulting tangle was even worse, but Buck took good care to keep the traces clear thereafter, and ere the day was done, so well had he mastered his work, his mates about ceased nagging him. Francois's whip snapped less frequently, and Perrault had even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and carefully examined them. So when Buck screws up, Dave and Sol-leks bite him. They nip at him. And at one point, they say that he kind of fought back, but that was even worse. So he found that just by learning from the nip, that he would get the instruction that he needed, and by the end of the day, he pretty much has this whole situation down. It was a hard day's run up the canyon, through Sheep Camp, past the scales and the timberline, across glaciers and snowdrifts hundreds of feet deep, and over the great Chilkoot Divide, which stands between the salt water and the fresh, and guards forbiddingly the sad and lonely north. They made good time down the chain of lakes which fills the craters of extinct volcanoes, and late that night pulled into the huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where thousands of gold seekers were building boats against the break-up of the ice in the spring. Buck made his hole in the snow and slept the sleep of the exhausted just, but all too early was routed out in the cold darkness and harnessed with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, the trail being packed, but the next day, and for many days to follow, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. So what this means is breaking the trail means that no one has to run on it or pack down the snow. So you must do it yourself. So no one has cleared this trail at all, so you're running in fresh snow and it makes everything harder to deal with. As a rule, Perrault traveled ahead of the team, packing the snow with webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francois, guiding the sled at the gee-pole, sometimes exchanged places with him, but not often. Perrault was in a hurry, and he prided himself on his knowledge of ice, which knowledge was indispensable, for the fall ice was very thin, and where there was swift water there was no ice at all. Day after day, for days unending, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark, and the first gray of dawn found them hitting the trail with fresh miles reeled off behind them. And always they pitched camp after dark, eating their bit of fish and crawling to sleep into the snow. Buck was ravenous. A pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough and suffered from perpetual hunger pangs. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less and were born to the life, received a pound only of the fish and managed to keep in good condition. He swiftly lost the fastidiousness which had characterized his old life. A dainty eater, he found that his mates, finishing first, robbed him of his unfinished ration. There was no defeating it. While he was fighting off two or three, it was disappearing down the throats of the others. To remedy this, he ate as fast as they, and so greatly did hunger compel him, he was not above taking what did not belong to him. He watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, a clever malingerer and thief, slyly steal a slice of bacon when Perrault's back was turned, he duplicated the performance the following day, getting away with the whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but he was unsuspected, while Dub, an awkward blunderer who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's misdeed. So Buck has learned to be cunning and to steal things just like his other counterparts. He's at this point only out for himself, no matter the cost, and he's in a way becoming more like Spitz. He steals food, and Dub gets punished for it. So he's kind of learning bad habits, but habits that are necessary for him to get more food and to be a happier and more contented dog. This first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capacity to adjust himself to changing conditions, the lack of which would have meant swift and terrible death. It marked further the decay or going to pieces of his moral nature, a vain thing and a handicap in the ruthless struggle for existence. It was all well enough in the Southland under the law of love and fellowship to respect private property and personal feelings, but in the Northland under the law of club and fang, whoso took such things into account was a fool, and in so far as he observed them, he would fail to prosper. So this means that doing the right thing is a setback. You must be out for yourself only. So this is where we really start to see him go back to those old instinctual ways, because a wild animal would have no idea of what's morally right and wrong, what's the good thing to do, what's the not good thing to do. So Buck is now starting to do this, and he doesn't really care about what's right and wrong anymore. He's really out for himself and to get the best nourishment and the best that he needs for himself. Not that Buck reasoned it out. He was fit, that was all, and unconsciously he accommodated himself to the new mode of life. All his days, no matter what the odds, he had never run from a fight. But the club of the man in the red sweater had beaten into him a more fundamental and primitive code. Civilized, he could have died for moral consideration, say the defense of Judge Miller's riding whip. The completeness of his de-civilization was now evidenced by his ability to flee from the defense of a moral consideration and so save his hide. He did not steal for the joy of it, but because of the clamor of his stomach. He did not rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly out of respect for club and fang. In short, the things he did were done because it was easier to do them than to not do them. His development, or retrogression, was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew callous to all ordinary pain. He achieved an internal as well as external economy. He could eat anything, no matter how loathsome or indigestible, and once eaten, the juices of his stomach extracted the least particle of nutriment, and his blood carried it to the farthest reaches of his body, building it into the toughest and stoutest of tissues. Sight and scent became remarkably keen, while his hearing developed such acuteness that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it heralded peace or peril. He learned to bite the ice out with his teeth when it collected between his toes. When he was thirsty, and there was a thick scum of ice over the water hole, he would break it by rearing and striking it with stiff forelegs. His most conspicuous trait was an ability to scent the wind and forecast it at a night in advance. No matter how breathless the air, when he dug his nest by a tree or bank, the wind that later blew inevitably found himself to leeward shelter and snug. So he is continuing to go back to old ways to become more wild. So he learns instinctively that when ice builds up in his toes or on his water dish, he needs to find ways to get rid of it. He learns to smell in the air when a storm is coming so that he can put his hole in a more secure place so he doesn't get as covered by snow. And so the shelter will be more snug for him. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became again alive. The domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways he remembered back to the youth of the breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the primeval forests and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and the quick wolf snap. In this manner he fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which they had stamped into the heredity of the breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they had been his always. And when on the still cold nights he pointed his nose at the star and howled, long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead and dust, pointing nose at star and howling down through the centuries, and through him, and his cadences were their cadences, the cadences which voiced their woe, and what to them was the meaning of the stiffness and the cold and dark. Thus, as token of what a puppet thing life is, the ancient song surged through him, and he came into his own again. And he came because men had found a yellow metal in the Northland, and because Manuel was a gardener's helper whose wages did not lap over the needs of his wife and diverse small copies of himself. So Buck is becoming wild like his ancestors because he has learned to steal, and that stealing and all of these things that he's learning along the way have changed his life forever. He would never have tapped into these roots if he had stayed at the judge's house. So if Manuel hadn't been greedy and hadn't been a gambler, then Buck would never have learned any of these things. All right, so now you're going to move on to your Schoology quiz and questions. You just have multiple choice and short answer today. I just want to go through the short answer with you. It says if the word develop means to grow or become more advanced, and the word regressed means to return to a less developed state, use these definitions to answer the following question. So do you think Buck has developed or regressed in his new life? Is he moving forward and learning new things? Or is he going back to the old way of doing things? Or is it a little bit of both? Right? I want you to explain this, and please explain using quotes and details from the text. Thank you. I'll see you next time.